I believe in the power of prayer. Not to get what we want, but to get what God wants. I believe in the power of prayer. I believe in the importance of prayer. If prayer is something God does, then it must be important. As water is to plants, so prayer is to the spiritual life. Without it, we die. And I believe in the mystery of prayer. Stuff goes on in prayer which is way beyond our comprehension. I mean, God is moved, we are changed, circumstances sometimes shift. More happens in this universe as a result of prayer than I think we will ever know or understand. But I also know that we have a way of making prayer so complicated for people. I've read books and heard sermons that left me feeling like it was just too much. It put me off prayer rather than encouraged me in prayer. And I bet if you did a survey of Christ followers and said, what are the things that you find difficult or challenging in your faith, I bet you prayer would be right near the top of the list for many people. Now today is Pentecost Sunday, and one of the readings for today includes the spectacular passage from Romans 8. And Romans 8, by the way, is considered by many to be perhaps the most notable chapter in the Bible. And one of the things that our short passage teaches us about today is prayer. Now, prayer, of course, is this vast topic. And I'm only going to, even as Paul does, I'm only going to deal with just a little sliver of the topic. And I really want you to understand that what we say today about prayer is not the all-defining comment on prayer. It's just a small sliver of the pie. And I think for me, the heart of that little sliver is prayer was never meant to be complicated. Prayer was never meant to be a burden for anyone. In fact, prayer is one of God's great gifts to us. And I think it's a terrible thing that Christian leaders and teachers and authors have often made it like a noose around our necks. It's a gift. And I really hope and pray that in our time together that you will feel encouraged to pray perhaps more deeply and perhaps even more often. So let me climb straight into it and look at three things that emerge out of these verses that Paul teaches us about prayer. The first thing for me is that we learn that everyone can do it. Everyone can do it. Paul writes, in our weakness, we do not know how to pray as we ought. In our weakness, we do not know how to pray as we ought. I love this confession. I love the admission that none of us, he doesn't qualify who it is, it's just all of us. None of us knows how to pray as we ought. And Paul seems to write it as if it's a permanent condition. It's not something that we seem to outgrow. We live perpetually in a state of not knowing precisely how to pray as we ought. In other words, we all remain novices at prayer. We all are prayer amateurs. There are no experts when it comes to prayer. Be suspicious of anyone who presents themselves as an expert at prayer. So prayer is for everyone. Everyone can do it because everyone needs the help of God's Spirit to do it. If you've ever seen wildebeest calves being born on the African plains, you'll get a sense of what I mean by this. Just seconds after a wildebeest calf is born, they try to stand up. They stumble around, but quite quickly they are able to stand. Shaky, but they're able to stand. And eventually they grow in strength and confidence. And I think prayer is a bit like that. When we first start, we may be a bit shaky, but we all get to stand quite quickly. And then as the weeks, months, and years go on, we become more and more confident in it. So prayer is a lifetime of learning and discovery. It's not about achievement or about excellence. It's just about a lifetime of learning to discover the wonders and the gift that prayer is to us all. Anyone can pray. Everyone can pray because we have the help of God's Spirit. And then the second thing I want to say about prayer today is that it's very ordinary. It's very ordinary. Now, the irony of that statement is that we learn that through what I think is a quite extraordinary comment of Paul's. Paul says the Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. The Spirit of God, says Paul, is praying on our behalf. He's praying with us and for us with sighs that are too deep for words. A few verses earlier in Romans 8, Paul explains to us that the whole of creation is groaning under the weight and the burden of sin. He uses this graphic picture of saying the whole of creation is like a woman in labor pains waiting to give birth. And then he goes on to say, and it's not only creation that's groaning, but he says we too are groaning under the weight and the burden of sin. And he says, and while we're waiting for that day of redemption, that day of liberation, Paul says, while we're waiting, the Spirit is praying with sighs too deep for words. He's praying with us, and he's praying for us with sighs too deep for words. Now, I'm not cycling quite as much as I did a few years ago, but I do still ride my bicycle. And one of the gifts which cycling quite unexpectedly gave to me was that it gave me space to pray. I didn't plan it, it just kind of happened. As I rode, I found myself beginning to talk to the Lord, and then quite quickly I discovered that I really didn't need to do that much talking. I just began to feel on those bike rides the company of Jesus. And I don't want this to sound all kind of spiritual, because whatever one makes of that word, because it actually isn't. It really was very ordinary. It's just a guy on his bicycle. But when I leave home, if you'll pardon this detail, while I'm still trying to get my bum comfortable in my saddle and doing the first few turns of my pedals for those first few meters, in that settling down moment, I just say something like, well, Lord, here I am. And then off I go. And I can't quite explain it, but almost every time something feels like it happens. The company of Jesus is with me. I know people aren't mad about cyclists doing that, but I often listen to music when I ride. So whether it's Mozart, Billy Joel, Dire Straits, whatever it is, and I'm navigating traffic or gasping for breath up a hill, in the midst of all of that kind of busyness, I consistently feel the company of Jesus. Richard Rohr defines contemplation as being the practice of being fully present. The practice of being fully present. Now, I can't ever say that I'm fully present when I'm on my bicycle, because I'm mostly concentrating on staying alive. But it is undoubtedly a time for me, a time of being present to God and present to myself. In fact, perhaps almost like no other time, to be present to God and to be present to myself. And that's prayer. I think people mostly think of prayer, if you understand what I mean by this, as trying to get God to fit into our world. So we ask God to do things like, please give me a parking spot at the mall. Please give me good weather for our family lunch. And I'm sure that that kind of praying has its place. God is a good father who loves to give good gifts to his children. But I want to encourage you today to think less of prayer as trying to get God into our world, and to think first and foremost of prayer as a way for ourselves to get into God's world. As prayer is a way of learning to enjoy the ordinary company of Jesus in the ordinary everyday of our lives. Whatever we're doing, drinking coffee early in the morning, even chatting to a friend, riding a bike, walking, whatever it is, just to learn to enjoy the company of Jesus in the ordinary part of life. And maybe you want to observe the thing I do. You don't have to. There's no magic to it. But perhaps before the beginning of the day or before an activity, you could just say, Lord, here I am. And off you go. These sighs, too deep for words, which Paul speaks of, they speak to me of being in God's company in a way where words aren't necessary. And I think it's a very special place to be in God's company where words aren't necessary. It's a moment where we realize that God knows us deeply, that God participates in the deepest part of who we are. He feels our pain. The Spirit connects with our groaning. And he doesn't only connect with our groaning, but he takes our groans and he turns them into prayers. But more than that, not only does God get in on what's going on for us, but in quietness, in some form, whatever it is, of contemplation, in the company of Jesus, whatever language you prefer to use, we don't only invite God into the depths of who we are, but we have the opportunity then to get in on what God is doing, what's on God's heart. And I think the more we learn to be in God's company quietly, in an ordinary, everyday way, the more we will begin to notice the things that I think God would notice about our world. The more we'll learn to love the things that He loves, the more we'll learn to desire the things that He desires. One time Mother Teresa was asked by a journalist, when you pray, what do you say to God? And she answered, I don't say anything. I listen. So the interviewer asked, so then what does God say to you? And Mother Teresa answered, God doesn't say anything. God listens. The third thing I want to say about prayer today that emerged for me out of this passage is that in prayer, anything goes. In prayer, anything goes. Paul writes, the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. The Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. So it's very important to understand that in prayer for us, anything goes. I find it quite wonderful, and it's not the right word to use, because I don't think there is such a thing as a mistake in this context. But if we imagine that we made a mistake when we prayed, if we felt like we were off the rails when we prayed, we rest in the knowledge and the confidence that the Spirit will put us back on track. He will, on our behalf, pray according to the will of God. Over the years, I've heard so many people worry that their prayers haven't been answered because they imagine perhaps we didn't pray properly, perhaps we didn't say the right things, perhaps we didn't say the right words, perhaps we were too selfish, maybe we were too angry in our prayers, perhaps we didn't have enough faith. But it just isn't so. I can't say exactly why those prayers weren't answered the way the people prayed them, but the one thing I do know is that those prayers weren't not answered because they prayed wrongly, because people made a mistake. There's no such thing. What we pray inappropriately, if you like, the Spirit makes right. In fact, there is no such thing as an inappropriate prayer. Even though the scriptures are filled with prayers many of us might think are inappropriate, there is no such thing. If you look at the Psalms, you'll see selfish ones and violent prayers and arrogant prayers and vengeful prayers and a whole bunch of others. And Paul tells us that the Spirit, with sighs too deep for words, instead of dismissing those prayers, instead of blocking his ears to those prayers, the Spirit takes our heartbreak and He takes our anger and He takes our despair and He takes our desperation and He transforms them into prayers according to the will of God. Isn't that a wonderful, wonderful promise? That God takes our prayers, appropriate or inappropriate, and He transforms them into prayers according to the will of God. And for that reason, we say confidently in prayer, anything goes. When it comes to prayer, as I suppose it is in many other parts of life, honesty will always beat insincerity. So when you pray, say what you like, and know that the Spirit will help you in your prayers. C.S. Lewis said of prayer, may it be the real I who speaks, and may it be the real thou that I speak to. So my dear friends, in conclusion, my simple word is pray. Anyone can do it. It is a very ordinary thing. Let it be an ordinary thing for you. And remember that when you pray, anything goes. And P.S., by the way, don't let anyone mess this up for you. God bless you. Take care.